Pick one. Is it when
Tom
does it
just
blow
came
up?
in.
Does it blow up now, or does it blow up a year from now? Dr. Tomberlin.
You there, Lynn? All right, we got you back on then.
All right. We are ready, I believe, at this time to reconvene. It's 1 p.m. We're going to hear from Dr. Tomberlin. Dr. Tomberlin, you're up.
Good afternoon.
Still there, guys?
Yep, can you hear?
Okay, yep.
So, my understanding is the charter school advisory board members would like to ask me questions about licensure, so I didn't prepare any kind of presentation.
Tom, I don't believe that for a second.
I believe Dave was interested in speaking about maybe the lateral entry program.
A replacement?
That
Hopefully much shorter than the state board discussion was on it.
Great. I'll see what I can do. As long as you don't ask any questions, it should go pretty quickly.
So Tom, in the context, as you know, the law requires charters to only have 50% of their teachers licensed. So we are pretty adept at bringing folks in that don't have a license and getting them on track towards that. So I think it's in that context of what's that process going to look like going forward.
Sure. Now, correct me if I'm wrong, but you can have 50%, only 50% of your faculty licensed, but all of your EC has to be licensed.
That is correct.
Okay.
Yes.
So this does have implications
Federal.
for most of you. So as you all know, Senate Bill 599 put a time limit on the lateral entry process, and that is June 30th, 2019. After that date, no other lateral entry licenses can be issued by the state of North Carolina. Now, we will continue to support folks on a lateral entry license until the 3 years is up, which would be June 30th, 2022. So anybody who gets a license you could still apply for a lateral entry license. There's no guarantee that it will get processed by the June 30th deadline, because that was April 15th was the last day to submit that with a guarantee that you would get the license. But if you were to submit and it got processed, you would have a 7/1/2019 start date, and therefore a 6/30/2022 expiration date for the lateral entry license. 599 also froze all policies related to lateral entry licenses at the time of its passage. So that was back in 28, it's about a year and a half ago, I think so lateral entry hasn't changed since then, and how it's listed in current State Board of Education policy is how it will remain. There can be no revisions to that. And so that will continue through 2022. After 6/30/2019, the alternative, and I use that in quotes because the alternative is rapidly becoming the dominant path to licensure, which we would call lateral entry, will shift to the residency model. And the residency model really looks very similar to lateral entry. It is built for those educators who come in with a baccalaureate degree, but no formal educator preparation courses. Those folks will have to affiliate with an EPP, a State Board of Education approved EPP, and they will have up to 3 years to gain the recommendation for licensure from that EPP. So that can look very different depending on what kind of EPP you're affiliated with. For some IHE-based, I'm throwing around acronyms, and I'm sorry. An EPP is an educator prep program. Some of them are affiliated with Institutes of Higher Education, or EPP, or IHEs. So in those cases, oftentimes This program of study would be courses that one takes. And the EPP may give you a list of courses that you have to take in order to gain their approval or recommendation for licensure. It doesn't have to work that way, though. There are some EPPs that are not affiliated with an IHE. And I think of Teachers for Tomorrow, one of our most recent EPPs that gained board approval. This is not a degree granting institution, so they have developed a series of professional development opportunities and maybe online courses that their candidates enroll in and participate in. And at some point when the Teachers of Tomorrow feels like that teacher has the necessary pedagogy training, they will recommend them for licensure. And so there's no formal IHE coursework involved. So this changes a lot of the way we think about the lateral entry process or the alternative method, because no longer is there the requirement that this is formal coursework from a degree granting institution in order to complete that program of study. So what the residency license requires that was not required under the lateral entry process is that each employing agency, so an LEA or a charter school, has to have a formal memorandum of understanding, or an MOU, with the EPP about what kind of supports that the EPP will offer their candidate. So those are not clearly defined in law. It just recognizes that there has to be that formal articulation between the employing agency and the EPP about what will be offered those teachers. And of course, the idea is that the EPP actually exercises some oversight into the practice of the candidate, that they're not simply just turning them loose and giving them a course or two to take and not really monitoring how they're performing in the classroom. So we're struggling with this a bit because conceivably this would look different for the 115 LEAs and the 160,
187,
170,
84, yeah, you're right.
84 plus, yeah.
184 charter schools plus the 50 plus EPPs in the nation. So I mean in the state. So you do the multiplication. That's a whole lot of MOUs, and we of course the schools, charter schools, and all of public schools are kind of looking back to NCDPI saying, what is this MOU supposed to look like? And so this is part of the thing we struggle with this kind of loose, tight oversight. We want to allow as much flexibility as we possibly can, but it's clear that the EPP, that the schools are looking for some guidance and direction about what are the basic requirements of this kind of MOU between schools and the EPPs.
So I know our legal team's going to love me for asking this question, but is there a discussion about a sample MOU that can be used as a template for not only charters but for LEAs? Because that's going to be a reality that hits hard. Because I got a follow up to that, but I want to hear if we've given that some thought. Sorry, guys.
That work has not been done, no. It hasn't been requested yet either.
So, Tom, I think this is important for the charter world in particular, given that quite a few schools are fairly close to that 50% threshold. When you get a teacher, when you had gotten a teacher on a lateral entry, that lateral entry license was considered part of your percentage of licensed teachers. I'm 99% sure of that. Correct, Ashley?
That would be correct, yes.
So, under this new arrangement, in the new program, would that be considered a license? It would be? So that's
Yes.
going to continue.
The residency license is a full license.
Great.
comparable to an initial professional license.
Great.
The only time that a school is going to, as a matter of fact, any license we give a candidate or an applicant would be considered a license for the purpose of satisfying that requirement or for the purposes of being positioned on the salary schedule. Where you get into trouble is whether we consider the license to be in-field or out-of-field. Now, that's the new federal reporting requirement, which we won't consider for the purposes of in-field, out-of-field provisional licenses, emergency permits, or permits to teach, or emergency licenses. And those are the only ones but the person can still be paid. It will still satisfy your requirement for licensed staff. But for the purposes of federal reporting, we consider those to be out of field by definition. And so that's the only area that you would have concern about. If you got somebody on a permit to teach, you could still count them as a licensed teacher.
So legislatively, by our laws, it would still be considered percentage licensed, but you'd still have the federal requirement of out of field that could be problematic.
Yeah, that's so the out of field is the purpose of the ESSA out of field designation is trying to get a handle on or an understanding of how teachers are distributed among student populations. And so what we're really looking for with that is if you have a teacher that hasn't completed the requirements, testing requirements for a license, and we know that happens all the time, but what we're really looking for there is, are those teachers differentially assigned to students of color and poverty? And if that's happening, then that's the problem we want to try to address, and that ESSA is trying to address. So the only time that this is really going to come up as problematic is if the analysis of your infield percentage is disproportionately visited on vulnerable student populations. If it's spread evenly across everybody in all student populations, then we understand that sometimes you have to do that to staff your schools. But we're particularly looking for the distributions on that one.
I think it's important that we get messaging out to the charter schools through our newsletter about what these changes mean for them. Can you elaborate while we're on this with the out-of-state licensure, what that's going to look like for charters as well as traditional schools?
So at its May board meeting, the State Board of Education approved policies. Actually, I take that back. It was April. At the April board meeting, the State Board of Education approved several policies related to out-of-state teachers, and this is in relation to the testing requirements. So for any out-of-state teacher that comes to us, well, let me separate this to two camps. There's elementary education / exceptional children general curriculum, which we usually call ECGC. So elementary ed and ECGC are one group. Everybody else, if you're coming from out of state and you bring with us a licensure exam that was a component of or a piece of getting licensed in another state, then we will grant you a license in North Carolina and not require any additional testing. If you are coming to us from out of state and you are seeking a license in elementary education or ECGC, if you have greater than 3 years of experience and you have a licensure exam with a passing subtest score with math and reading, we will take that and not make you test. If you come in ECGC, elementary education, with fewer than 3 years of experience, you will take the North Carolina tests regardless of whether you've passed another test. So those are the new systems. Now there's a special provision in there that the test has to be, the passing score of the test has to be at the vendor recommended cut score. So if you are a state that decided to put your cut score lower than what Praxis or Pearson said was the recommended score, then the candidate has to meet the vendor's cut score, not the state's cut score, in order for this to qualify. But other than that, we will take the tests from anybody coming from out of state in all subject areas, regardless of their years of experience. But there's these special circumstances around elementary ed and ECGC.
You know, thank you, Dr. Tomlin, for coming to talk about this, because I'll get on my soapbox again, but Friday we hit a new 50-year low in unemployment, 3.6%. And I think we have to recognize, screaming at us, it's going to be tougher and tougher to recruit qualified teachers in the classroom. And we've got to be realistic about ensuring we have a qualified teacher in front of our kids. And how we qualify, that's the challenge.
Absolutely. And I think most of you know that licensure is in a state of extreme flux right now. There are several bills in the legislature that have impact on licensure, and that's how we're currently thinking about it in the wake of 599. So we're just to the point where we're starting to get everything that was in Senate Bill 599 implemented into policy and practice, and this session is going to throw even more changes at us from that. So it gets increasingly hard for us to keep up with it, and I'm sure it's very difficult for you. So to that end, our division, the school, I'm sorry, I can't remember what my department is called.
Things are changing.
Educator Recruitment and Support. Yeah, the Office of Educator Recruitment and Support is going to hold a webinar very soon following every State Board of Education meeting, because it's quite common that we bring a new licensure policy every month to the State Board of Education. So we're offering webinars where we review what was either presented to the State Board of Education for discussion or what was approved by the State Board of Education in that month, and everyone in the world is welcome to attend.
So that comes to my question, because I got that email.
Good.
And it says go into Power School, into Eddie, and you'll send it to the HR person. We don't get to choose an HR person.
Oh, that's right. So that message was actually for the LEAs, and I knew it wouldn't work for you, but Mr. Machado will often just forward my stuff on, and I forget to write out a separate list of instruction for charter schools. So you're right. So as far as the webinar goes, I don't care who comes. You write me and say I want to come to the webinar, I'll send you out the link. It doesn't matter. There are some other things though that the person who handles HR, if you get anything about that, like we'll only give this to the HR director in Eddie, all a charter school needs to do is have the director, because that's whoever's listed as the director of the charter school, send an email and designate somebody, and we'll add them to whatever they need. So that's the HR secure shell, or any of our other secure systems. We have the HR listserv. I will only add those people that the HR director or the superintendent directs me to. So your director of your charter school could designate anybody for that as well.
Okay, because I have been trying, I keep going back, and it wouldn't let me, never asked me for an HR person.
I apologize. I do have an LEA-centric frame when I write my emails, and I will try to be more inclusive with that.
I was just going to say, if we could make sure that that is in the newsletter, the weekly newsletter, 2 or 3 times, that our charter school, the operator just needs to email him. And
now, I will warn you that those webinars have to run. I have to mute everybody, and I do a lot of talking. So, but at least you'll hear the information, and then if you have questions, you can always call me back or email me with any questions. But just because there's upwards of 300 or 400 people on those, we can't open up the lines.
one quick question, you may not know the answer, which is fine. North Carolina cut scores on these licensure exams, are they the vendor cut scores?
In almost every case, yes.
They are the vendor, okay.
Right. The problem for us is the elementary ECGC. Our test is unique in the country, so nobody else uses those tests. So there's no way to do any kind of comparability on that.
What about the Foundations of Reading, Pearson? Does the state have the cut score from the vendor?
Yes, 227 is the cut score
227,
for
okay.
reading. Yeah.
I think Massachusetts has it higher.
So we did align with Massachusetts when we adopted the test in 2016, but they have subsequently moved on to a different version of Pearson. They still use Pearson, but it's slightly altered from what we use, so it's not exactly aligned.
Okay.
What is the requirement now for elementary to actually get your initial license? Because at one point you had to pass 3 tests, then you only had to pass 1 test, then you could take a different math test. What's the requirement to do it now?
So as of right now, if you have completed an educator prep program and receive the recommendation of the EPP, you can enter the profession, you can get the license without taking the test, as long as you attempt in the first and pass by the end of the second year.
And
of
that's not
teaching.
taking any pieces of it.
That's not taking any pieces of it. That's correct. You could have no testing and do that. In general, you don't have to. If you're lateral entry, you have all 3 years to pass the test. Not attempt in the first, pass in the second. So it is possible to enter the profession without taking any tests up front, and which is part of the reason why there's so much anxiety about these tests. Is people are coming into the profession and not having passed the test, and then realizing they are having extreme difficulty passing the tests. And in many cases, they're very good teachers that this is happening to.
So is there some provision, isn't there some provision at this point now where somebody can say you were a really good teacher, to certify you were a super duper good teacher, and then you can keep your license? How's that work?
So that's a current bill in the Senate Bill 219 that you all should keep an eye on. It will change the way that we think about how we deal with licensure in the state. And so one of those provisions is to give, because the initial license is a 3-year license, but the testing requirement has to occur in the second year or the license is in jeopardy. We've asked the legislature to align those two things. In other words, you need to bring the test by the time your license is expiring, rather than putting that artificial barrier at the end of the second year. And they've been responsive, and in the latest version of this bill, it gives us all 3 years. It gives the candidate all 3 years of the initial license or the residency license to pass the test. There's also an understanding that districts are having a really hard time hiring folks, or they find that good folks, really what they consider to be highly effective teachers, can't pass these tests. And so this bill gives the LEA or charter school, the employing school system, the opportunity to issue a limited license. And what that would mean is if I can't pass my licensure exam, if that's what's keeping me from full licensure, the superintendent or the charter school director and the principal can sign an affidavit saying that this is an effective teacher. The teacher can be issued a 3-year license that's only good for that employing entity. So you as a charter could license them for 3 years. An LEA could license them, but they could not use that license outside of that employing institution, and it's non-transferable. So you couldn't spend 1 year here and then the next county over says, I'll pick up your restricted license. And it can only be issued once. And so that gives them another 3 years to pass the test, and during that time they should be, the law says that the LEA or charter school will encourage them to get a CPL. And then one last piece of that is, which just came out in this version, is that any teacher with a license that expires June 30th, 2019, and hasn't met testing requirements will receive an extension until June 30th, 2020.
Oh.
So if they're gonna, I mean,
Across the board.
across the board, which has huge implications.
Wow.
And we're waiting to see if this is, we hope it passes by the end of the fiscal year because
How are you gonna get all of those
I know
out
how
right
we're
away?
gonna fix everybody that's
gonna track that?
that's broken. But so it's a really interesting bill that I think if you see that that's moving forward, or if you hear that it passes, it has really big implications for
What was the number on that bill?
219, Senate Bill
Senate Bill
219.
Senate?
And that's really responsiveness to a very tight labor market, I think, and facing that reality that it's gonna be increasingly difficult to recruit folks.
And,
Dr. Tomberlin,
So I gave you, I'm sorry, just a little bit on the being able to issue that restricted license or that limited license. There are a couple of exceptions to who can do that. There are counties that are listed as not being able to issue it. So Wake County would not be able to issue one of those restricted licenses, nor would any charter school in Wake County. So it has to do with the developmental, there's a rating system from Commerce that rates you as economically, your economic development level. One is poor, 2 is middle, and then 3 is high. Any county with a developmental rating of 3 and that has a population that exceeds 100,000 is not allowed to issue one of these licenses.
What about Mecklenburg?
Mecklenburg would not qualify. So there's about 14 of them in the state that would be excluded. I have a list of those. I went in and it goes to the 20. The other issue is the 100,000 is based on the most recent census. And so right now, the most recent census is 2010. But pretty soon, the most recent census is going to be 2020, and so some of those designations will change. And we'll just have to keep an eye on it. But it's a really convoluted and interesting system, but we're trying to keep track of it as best we can, right? So any city school system that resides in that, so like Cabarrus County is not able to issue those. Kannapolis is a small school system, a city school system within it. They are also prevented from issuing any of those licenses.
And this is because it affects their economic development designation?
I think it's an effort to, by the legislature, to recognize that the staffing issues in these less resourced areas of the state are much harder than they are in some of the more well-resourced. And the conventional wisdom is that these larger school districts tend to draw employees away from the smaller ones, and it's trying to give the
Even that
opportunity to recoup some of that to the smaller ones.
Is that the same thing as the tier 1, 2, 3 counties?
Yes.
I hear all the time.
Yes.
Okay.
Is there a converse to these provisions? What if someone passes a test, but they don't have any teacher education, or they haven't completed any requirements with an EPP? Could they get an?
That's a different process, right? So that's a great question. These only apply to the testing right now because the State Board of Education has an appeal process for extenuating circumstances for when a candidate is unable to complete the coursework requirements or any of the EPP requirements. So we're going to have to start thinking about that differently as well. It's not just formal coursework. It may be professional development or online course, whatever a non-IHE EPP decides to do. There is a current process for that those folks would fall under that appeals process through the State Board of Education. But currently, we don't offer any appeals process for somebody who's unable to pass their licensure exam.
You should sit down while you have the chance.
I should sit down when I have the chance. Good call.
And it's right at 1:30.
Thank you,
very
Dr.
much.
Very
Nice to
Tomberlin.
see you all.
Thank you.
Thanks, Tom. All right, great. So at this time, we're ready to take up our discussion from NC Connections Academy. Okay, so at the state board meeting, as would be expected, the state board sent us back our non-recommendation and asked us to go ahead and make a recommendation, which we will be doing today. I think that it might be prudent, given a couple questions that I have, to go into closed session to discuss with our attorneys.
Sure, I move we go into closed session to discuss legal issues surrounding the North Carolina Connections Academy amendment request. And these would be attorney-client privileged matters. So that's my motion.
And I second it.
All right. All in favor? All right.
Let's do it.
Take her into closed.
I'm gonna take Lynn in with us. I'm holding you in my I'm holding you in my hand right now.
Thank you.
make another motion to go out of closed?
I don't think so.
Do I need to move out in open?
Sure.
We're good?
Yeah, I think we're good.
We're good, okay. Mr. Chair, as we've thought about this a lot, I mean, this is the third month in a row that this has been going on. And I still feel like that we have really only two options. One is either to recommend that the amendment request is approved, or to not recommend the amendment request be approved, which would mean the termination of the charter. I think the pilot was just extended by 4 more years, and although I've got some concerns about the plan moving forward, and do have some concerns about the board's experience in virtual schools, I think that the best course of action, from my perspective at least, would be to recommend approving with a couple stipulations, with one of the stipulations being that the board, which I don't believe it's gonna be Connections Academy again, it's gonna be Quality Virtual, is that what it's called?
CVPE.
NCV,
NCQV.
NCQVE, if, that they would, be required, under the motion that I'll make here in a minute, that they'd be required to, present to the Charter School Advisory Board and give us an update at every regular meeting we have, until such time as we say we don't need an update anymore. Just so that we can keep a kind of a grasp on what's going on with the school, and things like enrollment, vendor agreements, things like that. And then I would also make as a stipulation that they be required to submit any documentation that the Office of Charter Schools requests, which is, is required under the charter agreement as is, but I think it goes without saying, but I'm gonna say it anyway, that they really need to provide the information, and it needs to be done quickly, so that we can make sure that we keep an eye on this thing. And then, not as a stipulation, but just as a recommendation to the board itself, the QVE board, is, I know that there's some talk of increasing the membership on the board, and I think they really need to consider finding somebody that is very experienced in virtual education models, to be able to give them some help, and, just to broaden out a little bit of what they've got. You're talking about a lot of students that are coming in here. So, Mr. Chair, I would move that we recommend to the state board that the North Carolina Quality Virtual Education Charter Amendment for North Carolina Connections Academy be recommended for approval, and that the following stipulations be placed on that approval. Number one, that the North Carolina Quality Virtual Education Board, either the whole board or a member of the board, and if the school leader wants to come, that's fine, but I think we need somebody from the board there, present at every regular CSAB meeting until the CSAB determines that things are well under control. And then also that the second stipulation would be that North Carolina Quality Virtual Education provide information to OCS upon its request. So that's my motion.
All right. Do we have a second of that motion?
I'll second it.
Okay, it's been properly moved and seconded. Any discussion? No discussion?
I appreciate, Mr. Walker, your motion and to agree with it. This is a really difficult decision for sure, and I keep thinking about those students and the families above everything else. You know, I don't know that see the role of CSAB as being an organization that should require a board to have a CMO or keep a CMO if they're not happy with it, EMO. I think that's the responsibilities of boards to make those decisions. At the same time, before us is, do we feel that this board, as currently constituted, can make this transition that they're trying to make away from, let's be honest, one of the most experienced and proven EMOs in this space of virtual schools. I think that's a really heavy lift. And if I answer the first question, no, I don't think it's our role to dictate to a board that they must have or keep a CMO, EMO that they're not pleased with. The answer to my second question is, I'm not sure. I share concerns about makeup of the board and experience, and if there's some of the information that we heard from both sides over the last couple of months and the recent information shared, I'm not gonna lie, gives me some pause, real pause. So, that's my statement. Feeling, I think we were, this morning we had we were talking about this charter school grants, and certain schools got a conditional yes. I wish we had that as an option, but we don't.
Yeah. Other thoughts or comments?
For the record, I just want to kind of ditto what my fellow board member, Mr. Friend said. I have grave concerns about the tasks in front of this board when it was started. I mean, this is a completely different board than who got the charter. So anyway, I just ditto those same comments for the State Board of Education. I'm voting yes, but I have grave concerns.
Why are you voting yes, given that?
Because I don't think we can dictate to a board that they have to stay with an EMO, and charters are given to boards. Even though this board, there's only one person left on it, it's got the charter. And I'm not so sure that CSAB would have given a charter to this. And I have concerns that the board was changing the conditions of the contract in the first year, and we didn't know anything about that. That was, they said it was contractual.
Yeah.
And things were changing even at the beginning that would have, I think, caused me to have concerns.
One clarification, if I may, I don't think it was the CSAB who gave the charter.
No,
Yeah, right? It was
right.
the
And I don't
outside
know
of this
if we
process.
would have given them.
Okay, I'm sorry, I
That's
misheard
what I
you.
meant.
I mean, I voted, I was one of two votes. I believe last time I voted to send this forward, largely because I believe that it's problematic. One, it is a pilot, and it is a unique situation, so it is unique, but as much as I share some of the concerns, and I think had the presentation that we had last month been an application, I don't think I would have approved it. That being said, that's not the decision that we're being asked to make, and I do, as much as I have concerns and questions that remain about the board's capacity to do this, despite what seems to be strong providers. I think even if you have strong providers, it's hard to that's difficult to manage. But I also don't like the idea of EMOs in North Carolina deciding, coming to us, or a board coming to us and saying we don't want to work with this EMO anymore. The EMO coming up and saying, this board is not working with us, and then the board in the process loses their charter. I have questions, I think this is a unique situation, we just haven't had it. So I would agree that, you know, we give charters to the board of directors, and even though this board of directors has changed somewhat, I think they have some work that they need to do, both from a governance and an operational standpoint, to do that, to take on what they're asking to take on. You know, I'm kind of the mind, hey, you haven't been making growth. The data hasn't been good. They're saying the plan we kind of were working isn't really working. We're trying to change it. So, okay, change it. If you can change it and you can make it better, make it better. If you can't, you know, you're not going to have a charter, certainly for not more than 4 more years. And I think that's a question that we have to ask about both our virtual public schools, because they're not making growth, and, you know, we have, I think there are hard questions to ask in general about the pilot as it kind of moves into its second phase. So I think my feeling is we should recommend this to the state board. Ensure that this group understands we're going to be very much in the weeds with what they're doing, and also that they're taking on this is a huge undertaking. And I know it seems feasible, and with $13 million or however much it is, but it's a huge task. And at this point, you're on your own. So it's kind of like, if you can do it, do it. We're giving you that opportunity, but we're going to be very much closely watching how it's executed. I mean, if you're under a microscope, and that's something to take to heart. So I'm going to be supporting Stephen's motion. All right. Anybody else? Ms. Turner, you're recusing, correct?
Yes.
All right, I'll call a question. So all in favor of Mr. Walker's motion? And Lynn, do you have anything to add on the phone?
No, I echo all of your sentiments as far as they're going to be held to a closer scrutiny, and that I do have serious concerns over this. But I think it's the right decision for the students. So I'm in favor.
Okay, so with that, we'll do hands, and then I'll ask for your vote, Lynn. So all in favor? Okay, so that's everyone here. Lynn, your vote?
Yes, I'm in favor. Yes, in favor, aye.
Okay, so the motion carries, and I'll bring that forward to the state board. I'm proposing that Mr. Walker got approval, tacit approval, I guess, or
They need to have, they need to have a
not formal
special call.
approval. Yeah, we're gonna do a
get this
called
done.
meeting. I also want to say that I think it's important. You know, Pearson has run effective models of the connections model, or running effective models around the country. This is an organization that we as a state said, hey, we want to work with. It didn't work out in this instance, but you know, they do a lot of good work. They do it in a lot of places in other parts of the country. I think it's just important to note. I don't see this. I see this as two groups, you know, not being able to work out or not being aligned on the vision that they all had at the beginning or whatnot. But I do think that Pearson has done some good work, and I know that they worked a lot to get this off the ground, and thank them for that. So, and we know that they're doing a lot of good work in education in a variety of ways. So, I just want to acknowledge that for sure. All right. Okay, moving on. We're gonna we will let the folks know about when the called state board meeting will be. It will be soon, and we're ready to talk about RTO. So, Dr. Williams.
Good afternoon, everyone. I am going to provide for you this afternoon a brief update on the status of the 14 schools that are scheduled to open this August. Once the last of the 14 opens, I will have been directly involved in the opening of 82 charter schools across North Carolina since in my time here in the Office of Charter Schools. You have 2 handouts, one digitally and one hard copy. The digital handout that you have is the April enrollment summary. So I'd like to take a moment to begin with that one.
Where's that at?
It's online.
Online.
Materials.
Yeah, that's all.
Everyone have it available? Okay. So you will see on the first page of this document all 14 schools listed, and you will note that I've been recording the number of applications that they have received so far. So the number of applications that they received as of March 23rd, and then the number of applications that they received total as of April 23rd, and that's what this report shows you. So in that, you will note that one school currently has enough applications to fill all of its projected seats, and that is Southwest Charlotte STEM. 11 schools are currently below the 75% enrollment threshold based on number of applications. This is only about applications, not actual enrollments. That we would normally expect by June 1st. And I say 11 schools instead of 12 because you will note that at the bottom of the page, Westlake is below its projected enrollment of 615 students. However, it has submitted an enrollment request to decrease its enrollment from 615 to 187 because of the temporary space that it will locate in its first year. So, the next enrollment report is due on May 24th, along with Part 2 of the RTO progress report and all of the evidences that are included in that. Starting with the May enrollment report, schools will be reporting the actual number of enrollments, so complete enrollment packets that they have received as of that point. And at that point, we will also be able to determine whether or not they have met your guideline of having at least 75% of their students enrolled by June 1st. Are there any questions about the enrollment summary?
So there's only 5 below that 75% right now.
There are 11 below the 75% right now.
So which ones are those? So Apprentice Academy?
I'm sorry, I'm sorry, I counted the wrong column.
You
You are
counted the March
correct.
column? Okay.
I did,
Yeah, so, I mean, there's some that need, like Blue Green needs some work. I mean, they're at 44%. The ones in the 60s, probably, Apprentice and Monroe and Ridgeview. I mean, like Still Creek. Everybody was worried if Still Creek would be able to fill that school, but it looks like they're gonna be able to, so.
Well, at least based on the number of applications that they've received so far. So it'll be interesting to see how many of those applications translate into actual enrollments.
Dr. Williams, of this group, are there some of those that were on a delay?
Yes, there are several that are currently in a delayed year. They are Apprentice, Bonnie Cone,
That's right.
Carolina, Discovery, which is in its second 1-year delay, Monroe, and Westlake.
So 4 of those 5 are already in a delay.
course, Westlake's gonna be over 100%
Yeah.
once the state board approves this amendment.
Because we voted on that today.
There's 6 that are in delay.
But of those 4 are below the 75%.
Oh, yeah, right, okay.
Are there any other questions about the enrollment summary?
My question is just, which do you feel the facility update, like which do you view as more important? from your
Between enrollment
perspective?
and
Yeah,
facility?
Yeah. So like, I'm looking at Pocosa and their enrollment looks okay, but their facility, they're listed as below standard.
Oh,
And they're
well-
one of our accelerated ones, so I'm just kind of curious, in your opinion, which you value more.
Well, let me, before I answer that question, let me explain the setup of the facility update. And all of you should have a copy of that, a hard copy at your seats. Did I miss anyone? As a facility update, Mr. Quigley is actually giving you 2 different pieces of information. So the middle column is giving you an update about the facility, the actual
Okay.
space where the school will be located. But the last column is giving you an update about their RTO Progress Report 1
Just
status.
all together, okay.
So yeah, they are not all together. So if a school has satisfactory, as the first school does listed there, it's not saying that their facility status is satisfactory. It's saying that their completion of the RTO Progress Report Part 1 is satisfactory.
And that's not, there's nothing in there about enrollment that qualifies you as satisfactory.
Right, there's nothing in the Part 1 evidences that is related to enrollment or facility. All of that comes in Part 2.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Thanks for the question. So, if you do turn your attention to the facility update, you will see that one school currently has a certificate of occupancy, and they are working, that's Discovery, they're working on some minor updates to that facility, and will be getting a fire inspection later in the summer, or later in the spring, so that they will then have completed all of their requirements related to their facility. One school currently has not identified its temporary space, and that is Bonnie Cone. They found out, they are building a new facility, and they found out last week that that facility will not be ready until October. And so they are now working to locate a temporary facility, and they have 3 options, and we'll be providing an update on which of those 3 options they have selected in the RTO evidences that are due on May 24th. As I mentioned, the last column of this report shows the status of the schools when we completed the review of their RTO evidences from Part 1. There were 6 categories total that had evidences to be submitted in December and resubmitted in March based on the feedback received from the December items. Those 6 categories were board governance, student accountability, key staff, school safety, policy manual, and employee handbook. Out of the 14 schools, 7 were rated satisfactory, 3 were rated exceptional, and 4 were rated below standard due to being insufficient in one category. Happy to answer any questions that you might have or walk you through this further if you would like.
Can you elaborate on the below standards, what their insufficiencies were?
Sure. So if we start on page 2, we'll see the first below standard was with Pocosin, and that was related to their policy manual. There were several policies that they received feedback on based on what they submitted in December, and that they were to resubmit in March. And they, for many of those policies, did not address the feedback that was provided to them. And so after collectively looking at the policy manual section, there was enough not addressed in the resubmission that we felt it was necessary to rate them as insufficient for policy manual, which then made them below standard overall. For Ridgeview Charter School, their insufficient was in board governance, and it was primarily related to their minutes and what appeared to be the structure of their meetings, although we have not, to be clear, we have not attended one of their board meetings, but in picturing a board meeting based on the minutes that were provided, there were some deficiencies that we expected to be acknowledged. Obviously, you can't go back if you've already had the meeting, but we expected them to at least acknowledge them and tell us about what they were going to be doing going forward in their meetings. And they did not address the feedback that we provided to them about their minutes at all. Their bylaws were also in very poor condition. In fact, what they submitted to us, I would not consider bylaws at all. And when they resubmitted the items, they just resubmitted the same thing. They have since then, on this past Friday, the board chair has submitted or has sent me a document that she is calling bylaws, and she has asked me to take a look at it, and I will be doing that this week to provide her some feedback to make sure that they have adequate bylaws in place. There were a couple other things in board governance as well that they either did not address or did not address at a satisfactory level. For both Steel Creek and Westlake, those are both Charter Schools USA schools, and so as you might imagine, their evidences were very similar. So they both received insufficient in the same category, which was the employee handbook. When they submitted the employee handbook in December, they submitted the Charter Schools USA standard employee handbook that it uses for all of its schools. We provided them feedback asking them to provide a school-specific handbook related to what the board, as the joint employer, would expect of its employees, and they did not do that. Neither school did. Are there any other questions about the facility update or the RTO status from part one?
In your opinion, how concerned should we be about the people that are below standard?
I think at this juncture, we do not have enough to require them to delay their opening. It will be interesting to see how well they perform on their RTO Part 2 evidences and whether or not they've taken the overall feedback received from Part 1 and provide us higher quality documentation with Part 2.
Great.
On the facilities, almost everybody's saying we're going to have it. How confident are you that these things are moving along as suggested?
I'm confident that they're moving along. I believe that at this time of year, folks tend to be a little optimistic. And so when you have a projected move-in date of June, or maybe the building's going to be ready in early August, my experience tells me that those things tend to happen in the middle to late August. So again, it'll be interesting to see how many of them are actually able to provide concrete evidences related to their facilities in the RTO evidences that are due in just a few weeks.
All right. Any other questions for Dr. Williams? All right, we'll be hearing more from you soon, I think.
You will be hearing more from me. At this meeting, and the primary purpose for my presentation, in addition to just sharing this information with you, is to ask you to make a preliminary recommendation to the state board so that when they get your final recommendation after your June meeting, they are able to make a decision at their July meeting.
Okay. So would we be preliminary recommending all of these, or?
That is my recommendation to you,
Okay.
yes.
Can we do them as a slate? I think we can. We don't need to individually vote on them.
Nobody had to recuse, did they?
Do the full slate.
Okay.
I have to recuse on blue-green.
Okay, well, we're gonna do Okay, so I'm gonna ask for a motion for all, that we preliminary recommend all of the schools on Dr. Williams' list of ready to open, with the exception of Blue Green.
I will make that motion.
Anybody I know.
All right, it's been properly moved and seconded.
It's the ice cream truck.
Sorry. Trying to figure out how to cut this thing off.
Do you like me to sit on it?
I'm one of these that doesn't know much about these phones.
Okay, so, all in favor? Okay,
Whatever.
and now I'll ask for
Aye.
a motion on, to give preliminary recommendation on Blue Green Academy.
So moved.
Second?
Okay, it's probably moved in second. All in favor? Please note,
Aye.
motion carries. Please note, Ms. Turner's abstention. All right, all set.
Thank you.
And
Yep, thank you.
Dr. Williams, you said their next report is due to you the 24th.
Yes, ma'am.
We like when you have to come report because otherwise we don't see you.
Oh.
We like
And you
seeing
like that,
Oh,
that you
yes.
don't have to come see us.
It's probably a break for her. She gets to stay in the office.
We like to see you.
Thank you very much for that.
Mr. Chair, before I make my favorite motion of every meeting, I thought it would be good, and Eric may want to choke me after I say this.
Stop now, Stephen.
Won't even let you get that far.
So as probably most of you know, the state board's having to go through a rules-making procedure after a Supreme Court case that said, yes, the State Board of Education is subject to Rules Review Commission and rulemaking. And so I understand that some rules that are set for rulemaking have been submitted for public comment and things like that, and I thought maybe it would be a good idea for the Office of Charter Schools in their newsletter, whenever those are published, to let the operators know, so if they wanted to give a comment on them, that they would be able to do so. I just think that would be a good idea because these people are on the ground every day, and they might understand how a policy impacts them that we didn't think of.
Stephen, I take back my comment. That's an excellent segue on this. There are a number of existing policies in the state board's policy manual concerning charters that will be published in the North Carolina Register later this month. They will also be published on the agency's website. And right now we're finalizing our communication strategy to get the word out to all interested parties. So there will be 5 public hearings this summer, public comments period for all interested parties, whether they be operators, charter school parents, charter school students, if you like, and others in the community, to provide feedback on those existing policies that the state board has moved forward through this rulemaking process. So this is just the beginning of the journey, and I imagine that stakeholders across North Carolina will have many things to say, and voices from those here on the CSAB will be important to the state board as it sorts through those comments and evaluates them. So thank you for setting that up.
I move we adjourn.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
All right.
Yahoo!
Thank you all.
Right on time. There we go.
And they're gonna take that thing back.
Thank goodness for a one-day meeting this month.
Yeah,
Exhausting. This is an
my
exhausting
gosh.
one day.
I was here too much last week.
Next time y'all want to hear about licensure, can you just watch the webinar instead of making me have to sit through
Didn't you learn
We
something?
thought that was an important.
Yeah, I learned even more.
Yeah.
I'll wait till this is turned off
Uh-huh.
to tell you my full thoughts on licensure.
But it
Yeah.
really
I'll
is
just learn.
very
the same
important
page.
I know
to
it is.
understand.
Yeah.
Have
I
a
mean,
good one.
We signed this.
Bye, Dan.
If somebody can show me how
It's up to, up
Oh, it's
top.
right there.
Yep.
increases student performance, then I'm like, let's license.
Did I do it?